time I saw Shaylyn was in her bed, and I leaned down, and I said, "Daddy loves you," and gave her a kiss and hug.
In the early hours of a peaceful March morning in Spencer, Indiana, a toddler was no longer in her crib. There were no signs of disruption, no open doors, no broken locks. Everything inside the house appeared as it should, except for the absence of the little girl who had been there just hours earlier. The news sent quiet waves through the community, not because of a dramatic break-in, but because it pointed to something more unsettling. This wasn't the work of an unknown outsider. It was someone with a connection to the home, someone who had once walked through its doors with ease and acceptance, a person whose presence had once brought no concern. While this is a story of a disappearance, it also serves as a deeper reflection. It speaks to how trust, once given, can sometimes be misplaced. It shows how everyday comfort can be disrupted when the line between safety and assumption becomes unclear. And above all, it reminds us that care and awareness are just as important in the familiar as they are in the unknown. This is the story of a little girl named Shaylyn Ammerman. She lived in a quiet Midwestern town, in a home filled with familiar routines and gentle evenings. That night was no different. Just a peaceful household settling in, unaware that by the next sunrise, everything they knew would change. What began as an ordinary evening for her family soon became a memory marked by loss and uncertainty. The date was March 23, 2016. In Spencer, Indiana, a small and calm town in Owen County, mornings usually unfolded without concern. But on that particular day, a quiet tension lingered in the air. A 911 call was placed. Inside the house, 15-month-old Shaylyn had gone to sleep as she always did, tucked safely in her crib, surrounded by those who loved her. But when morning came, she was gone. There were no immediate clues to explain her disappearance. The home appeared untouched. No broken locks, no shattered glass, no signs that anyone had come or gone. The night had passed in stillness. Yet her crib stood empty. Her room, once filled with the quiet presence of a sleeping child, now echoed with unanswered questions. It was the beginning of a search that would leave a lasting mark on everyone involved. When it became clear that Shaylyn was missing, worry set in almost immediately. Her grandmother, Tamara Morgan, didn't wait to question what might have happened. She picked up the phone and called 911 without hesitation. First responders arrived within minutes, bringing urgency and reassurance to a household already filled with rising fear and confusion.
But before we begin, I just want to say thank you to my amazing viewers and subscribers. Your support through likes, shares, and comments means the world to me. Your engagement helps make these stories even more meaningful. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join our growing community of true crime enthusiasts. Inside the home that night were 6 adults, each familiar with Shaylyn and involved in her daily life. Her father, Justin Ammerman, lived there, along with her grandmother, Tamara, who had taken on the role of her primary caregiver. Also present were Adam, Shaylyn's uncle, Danny Morgan, Tamara's husband, a tenant named Kelly Rogers, and Kyle Parker, a longtime friend of the family who was often around and well known to everyone in the home. Shaylyn had last been seen the night before. Tamara had gently bathed her, prepared her nighttime bottle, and placed her into her crib shortly after 10 p.m. The evening had passed quietly. Nothing seemed out of place. There were no arguments, no noise, and nothing out of the ordinary. It was a peaceful night in a home where Shaylyn was surrounded by people she knew and trusted. What made the next morning so difficult to understand was how perfectly normal the night before had felt. Shaylyn was a bright, happy toddler, often dancing to any music she could hear. Her presence was gentle, her smile frequent, and she had a way of making the space around her feel calm and joyful. In many ways, she was the heart of the home, bringing laughter, light, and a quiet sense of peace wherever she was. Jessica Stewart, Shaylyn's mother, wasn't at the house that evening, but she and Justin shared parenting responsibilities. Jessica remained involved and attentive in her daughter's upbringing. From the outside looking in, there was little to raise an alarm. Shaylyn appeared to be growing up in a home where she was loved, supported, and cared for, surrounded by familiar faces and family who played a part in her everyday world. That morning, local law enforcement arrived at the home and began their process step by step. Each person inside the house was asked to share what they had seen or heard. Officers checked every window, every door, and the areas around the house, yet there were no obvious signs to guide them. Everything appeared untouched. The backyard remained still, and from the surrounding homes, no one had noticed anything unusual. The only fact that stood firm was that a little girl was missing. The focus quickly turned to the timeline of the evening. Who was home? What time did people go to bed? When was Shaylyn last seen? Tamara remembered putting her to sleep before 10:30 p.m. The others recalled watching movies together, passing the night as usual. Kyle Parker, someone familiar to the household, had stayed up a bit longer while the rest retired to their rooms. But by the time morning came, Kyle was no longer there. At first, the situation had the appearance of a routine missing child case. But as details began to unfold, a deeper concern began to surface. Nothing about the house suggested an outside disturbance. The environment was quiet. There was no sound of distress in the night. No alarms had been raised. And as authorities retraced each moment, they realized that the peacefulness of the scene made the child's absence feel even more confusing. Spencer, Indiana, a town known for its strong sense of community, was quietly shaken. News of the incident spread with concern, not panic. Residents followed developments closely, hoping for clarity. As officers continued their investigation, one question began to emerge more clearly than the rest. If no force was used to enter the home, had someone been allowed in? And if so, what did that mean for those already inside? With morning light settling across the home, a difficult truth began to take shape. What had at first felt like confusion was slowly becoming something else. A growing awareness that what happened may not have come from outside. It was a painful realization, not rushed but rising quietly. The possibility that trust had been broken in a space where safety had once been assumed. The stillness of the house no longer felt calm. It now held the weight of a question no one had thought to ask. When Shaylyn's absence was discovered, the response from her family was swift. A call was placed to emergency services shortly after 9 a.m., and local police were on the scene without delay. Inside the house, everything appeared calm, almost unchanged. Nothing seemed disturbed, and the setting felt almost too still. The only thing that stood out was the crib, which now sat without its little occupant. Investigators began by collecting statements from everyone who had been there the night before. Step by step, the pieces of the evening began to fall into place. From each detail, a timeline was slowly shaped. And as more information came to light, so did the urgency of the moment. The need to find out what had happened became more pressing by the hour.
By the afternoon, the investigation had moved well beyond the walls of the home. Police widened their search to surrounding neighborhoods, streets were canvassed, and officers began checking in with residents nearby. Community members showed up without hesitation, some ready to search, others offering support. Flyers were printed and people walked together, each step taken with quiet hope. Additional resources were brought in to assist, teams trained for missing persons, cases were activated, search dogs were guided through nearby fields and wooded paths. Focus turned toward the White River, located not far from the home. Boats were deployed, and special equipment was used to look beneath the surface. Land and water were both searched with care, and the town watched as every effort was made. As evening approached, the story reached the public. Local television stations began reporting what had taken place. Soon after, regional news outlets followed. By the next day, people across the country had heard Shaylyn's name. What started as a community effort had quickly grown into a case followed nationwide, drawing attention from viewers who hoped for answers. Even with the growing media attention, those leading the investigation were beginning to focus on what had happened inside the house. Among the names mentioned in interviews, one continued to be brought up: Kyle Parker. He had been present that night and was well known to the family. A friend of Shaylyn's uncle, Parker, had spent time at the home on many occasions. His presence had once been welcomed, familiar, and trusted. That evening, Parker had been among those gathered in the living room. The atmosphere had been relaxed, with light conversation and shared drinks. One by one, family members headed to bed. Parker, however, remained up after the others had gone to sleep. Several statements confirmed he was still awake well past midnight. Around 3 or 4 a.m., Adam recalled hearing the front door open. He looked briefly in that direction and believed he saw Parker walking out. He appeared to be holding something, but Adam wasn't sure what it was. That observation would become a point of focus in later interviews. Investigators later learned that Parker did not return to his own home. Instead, he visited someone he knew and asked to use their shower. He also requested that some of his clothing be washed. The friend found the timing unusual and made note of it when police followed up. New questions began to surface. Parker had both the time and the means. He had remained in the house when others had gone to sleep, and he left during the same early hours when Shaylyn was discovered missing. Yet there was still no physical clue that linked him directly to the situation. No items were out of place, and nothing clearly indicated wrongdoing. Still, his choices stood out. He didn't reach out to the family. He made no statements when news of the case spread. And while others searched, he kept a distance until authorities contacted him again. Although he hadn't been charged, Parker was no longer viewed as just another visitor. Investigators had started to examine his past. While there was no serious criminal record, it was his recent actions, not his history, that stood out the most. Why had he left at that hour? Why go elsewhere to clean up? And why remain silent when others were speaking out? As investigators placed events in sequence, one theory became more likely. What occurred that night didn't start from an outside threat. It pointed inward towards someone already present in the home. Before being named in the case, Kyle Parker had blended into the household's routine. He was seen as a regular visitor, familiar to the family and part of their extended circle. To them, he had never seemed out of place. Until now. Kyle had become a familiar face to Shaylyn's family. As a friend of her Uncle Adam, he had visited many times over the previous months. His presence never raised questions. He was calm, polite, and kept to himself. There was nothing in his behavior or background that suggested he would ever cause concern. That was what made the growing doubts so difficult. There was no obvious reason to suspect him. He didn't create tension, and he had no troubling history. People described him as gentle and quiet. If anything, his low-key nature made him seem more trustworthy. He was invited over again on March 22nd, just like other times. The evening was simple. Movies were played, conversations were light, and the environment felt routine. One by one, guests called it a night. Kyle remained up a while longer.
Staying awake after others had gone to bed wasn't unusual on its own. But as days passed and the investigation deepened, attention began to shift. Not because he had stood out, but because he hadn't. While the town rallied together and police expanded their efforts, Kyle kept his distance. He didn't check in or offer help. When asked questions, he responded calmly but briefly. It wasn't only his words that drew attention, it was also his silence. Then a significant development occurred. A close family member of Kyle's reached out. His stepfather, Mike Patton, made contact with law enforcement. He shared a concern, not about what he had seen, but about something Kyle had said, something that had stayed with him. According to the report shared with officers, Kyle had made a quiet yet unsettling remark. "They'll understand once she's found." It wasn't a direct admission, but it carried a sense of knowing, enough to make his stepfather, Mike, feel it couldn't be ignored. His choice to speak up became a turning point for the investigation. Investigators acted quickly. They expanded their focus beyond the immediate timeline. Attention turned to Kyle's personal habits, his relationships, and how he generally presented himself to others in his life. What emerged was a portrait of someone who had stayed largely unnoticed. Kyle had never been in trouble before. He didn't stand out in conversations. No reports had been filed against him. But officers began to wonder whether something subtle had been missed all along. He didn't go back to his residence that morning. He didn't reach out to the family. And while people across town gathered in support, Kyle remained apart from it all. Unreachable, silent. To the Ammerman family, the realization was deeply personal. This wasn't a stranger. It was someone they had welcomed into their home. He knew the environment well. He had been part of their daily lives, part of their shared spaces, without ever raising concern. And now it was that very familiarity, quiet and unnoticed, that caused the greatest doubt. Why hadn't he followed the same pattern as everyone else that night? Why had he chosen those words? Why did someone who always seemed harmless now appear so distant? Investigators didn't rely on assumptions or sudden discoveries. Instead, they studied behavior closely. It wasn't about what was said, it was about what had shifted, what was missing, and what no longer made sense. This case wasn't only about a single individual, it was also about familiarity. It explored how being close to others can sometimes blur judgment, and how placing trust in someone can delay even reasonable doubts. Kyle Parker had not forced his way into the Ammerman residence. He had arrived as a guest someone expected. He hadn't kept his distance. He was present, involved, and visible. This understanding changed the direction of the investigation. It added new layers of meaning for both the authorities and the family members who had welcomed him without hesitation. By the third day, the inquiry had evolved. It was no longer a broad, uncertain search. Investigators now followed a clearer path, focused on timing, movement, and behavior that was beginning to consistently lead back to one person. Detectives began interviewing everyone who had spent time in the Ammerman home the night Shaylyn was last accounted for. Each conversation was private, timelines were verified, and no assumptions were made without clear evidence. The approach remained precise and thorough. As new insights came forward, the focus narrowed further. Authorities secured legal permission to access Kyle Parker's digital footprint. This included location data, text history, and activity across online platforms. They weren't searching for a single clue, but instead for recurring signs. They began to notice irregularities, missing data, unclear responses, and a noticeable emotional distance compared to others involved. These observations gradually strengthened the case. To support their findings, investigators used polygraph testing. While not definitive, it served as an additional step. Most individuals present that night reportedly gave consistent answers. Kyle's results raised concern. During a later interview, Kyle's responses began to change. He offered to take officers to a location just beyond Gosport, Indiana, approximately 10 miles from the home. The site was remote, surrounded by trees and bordered by a river. It was there that the search concluded, and the findings aligned with the concerns that had been growing over several days. The area was secured with care, as law enforcement treated the site with urgency and precision. Specialists in forensic science arrived shortly after, working methodically to document the scene. Every object, no matter how small, was handled thoughtfully, marked, photographed, and preserved. What had once been an ordinary place was now viewed through the lens of careful investigation. Several items retrieved showed signs of exposure, either to natural elements or deliberate changes. Some garments were found to be damaged, which made certain lab tests more difficult. Yet despite these limitations, each piece added a new layer to the narrative. The findings didn't shout conclusions, but they whispered enough to suggest something had taken place, something that wasn't meant to be found.
Dr. Donna Stewart led the medical review with professionalism and focus. Though many specifics remained private, investigators later confirmed that her conclusions supported the direction the inquiry had already taken. Her findings gave weight to the suspicions already forming and helped prosecutors take the next legal step with greater confidence. Not all biological evidence offered clear results. Some samples were too compromised to draw full genetic links, but direct actions spoke volumes. Kyle Parker's cooperation, his willingness to show the site, stood as a major turning point. His behavior, his locations, and the absence of alternative explanations helped piece together the larger picture. By March 25th, just 2 days after the site was discovered, Kyle Parker was taken into custody. The charges filed were serious and reflected the gravity of what had been uncovered. The lack of complete forensic certainty was a hurdle, but the total weight of behavior, movement data, and testimony allowed the legal process to proceed. The progress made wasn't the result of a single clue. It was built slowly and carefully. Investigators moved step by step, speaking with those involved, reviewing statements and checking records. There was no rush to judgment, only patience and persistence. For someone who had seemed to blend in so easily, the quiet details made all the difference. And so, the silence that once surrounded Kyle Parker gave way to action. The story entered a new chapter, one guided not by speculation, but by facts. The emotional weight of the case remained heavy for the community, but now there was a path forward. With the investigation coming to a close, the responsibility shifted to the courts. It was no longer about uncovering what happened. It was about deciding what justice would look like. The focus turned from searching to resolving. Prosecutors began to review everything gathered, his locations, his interactions, and the digital trail that had quietly recorded more than words ever could. While the road ahead wouldn't be easy, the case had a direction. Challenges remained, but so did the commitment to finding closure. Some of the collected evidence from the scene had deteriorated or was altered in a way that affected its reliability. Laboratory assessments confirmed that certain crucial items could not be fully tested. While investigators had assembled a consistent timeline and noted clear behavioral patterns in Kyle Parker's actions, the physical proof needed to eliminate all doubt in a courtroom remained limited. This placed lead prosecutor Donald Vanderberg in a challenging position. Moving forward with a full trial meant accepting the uncertainty that came with partial forensic support. Given the public interest in the case, the final outcome needed to be dependable. It had to hold up under appeal, scrutiny, and time. With this in mind, the decision was made to pursue a resolution that avoided that risk. A plea deal was extended, and Parker agreed to accept responsibility for 2 serious charges. In return, the state would not pursue additional charges at trial. It was a compromise, but one that prioritized certainty over the possibility of an uncertain courtroom result. Parker received a 60-year sentence on the primary charge, along with 16 years for the second. These terms would be served concurrently, meaning he would remain in prison for the majority of his life. The decision brought structure and finality to a complex and emotionally charged case. Judge Lori Quillen addressed the court with clarity. She acknowledged that many had hoped for a public trial and perhaps a longer sentence. However, she emphasized that the agreement provided a resolution that would endure. The evidence, while persuasive, could be challenged. The plea ensured that the consequences would be upheld without risking reversal. The judge made it clear this path was chosen not out of ease, but out of responsibility. It ensured that Parker would not return to the community and that the legal outcome would remain intact through time. It was a difficult choice, but one grounded in long-term accountability. After sentencing, Parker was taken to Indiana State Prison. Based on the current guidelines, he will not be eligible for parole until 2061. This marked the formal conclusion of the legal process that began with discovery and investigation. For Shaylyn's family, the court's decision brought a measure of resolution. It did not erase the pain, nor did it resolve every unknown, but it did offer a promise that the person responsible would remain behind bars and that their voice had been heard through the justice process.
In the aftermath, communities throughout Indiana and beyond began to reflect more deeply on familiar questions. Who has unsupervised time with our children? How well do we truly know those we invite into our homes? Are we placing trust based on genuine understanding or simply because someone is known to us? Shaylyn's experience became a reference point for larger conversations. Parenting groups began focusing on establishing clear boundaries, even with relatives or longtime family friends. Law enforcement incorporated lessons from the case into training sessions, emphasizing how risk can exist quietly without obvious indicators beforehand. This case led many to rethink the assumption that danger always comes from outsiders. Instead, it showed that threats can arise from those already within a trusted circle. And this realization has been important in shaping how safety is approached. Her name has come to represent advocacy rather than fear. Families are encouraged to create clearer guidelines within their homes, to think carefully about overnight stays, and to recognize that familiarity does not always ensure security. For those following this documentary, this is the crucial moment. It's where knowledge turns into meaningful steps. Whether you are a parent, guardian, educator, or community member, take this opportunity to review your safety routines. Consider carefully who is granted access and reinforce the limits you set. Have open, age-appropriate conversations with children about trust, personal space, and protection. If you belong to a community, share this story, not for popularity or attention, but because spreading awareness can help prevent future harm. Cases like Shaylyn's are more than just isolated incidents. They serve as important reminders of how risk can be hidden within everyday environments. The most valuable response is to learn from these examples. Safety is not something that starts when something goes wrong. It begins with understanding and awareness, and that awareness starts with each of us. Thank you for watching through to the end. Your time and attention are deeply appreciated. If this story resonated with you, please consider sharing it with others to help raise awareness. Also, feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments. What caught your attention, or what changes do you think could help? If you haven't subscribed yet, now is a great time. More stories are coming, important accounts that deserve to be heard, and voices that need to be shared. To everyone supporting this channel through your views, likes, shares, and subscriptions, thank you. Your support makes it possible to continue creating content that informs and protects. Stay mindful, stay safe. I look forward to seeing you in the next video.